school principals in Richmond. I've talked to them about this issue long before the hearing on Mrs. DeVos, and they're pretty candid. They're pretty candid, often with parents with kids with disabilities. My longtime secretary in my office, who has worked with me for nearly 30 years, has a daughter with a disability. And she was going to parochial schools for a while in the early grades, but as she was, progressing up into kind of late elementary school, there just weren't the programs at the parochial school that were tailored to her particular situation, partly because the school was just too small. A really small school, it's tough to do education of kids with disabilities. You've got to have some particular training to be able to do it. And the difference of a small, K-8 parochial school and a larger county school is pretty significant. And the principal was really candid and honest in a way that my secretary appreciated, and I did too. I thought it was candid, saying, look, we just don't have the kind of educational program for somebody of your daughter's special needs that the public high school has. You really should think about that. And my secretary agreed and made the change to the public school, and it was actually a better environment because the resources, which are not cheap, the resources to help do disability-specific education were there. But imagine now what would happen if we start to invest money in private schools and we don't make them follow the disabilities law. So follow this through. We take $20 billion away from public schools. So that's weakening public schools' ability to do a lot of things, including educating kids with disabilities. We give the money to private schools. We don't require them to follow the Disabilities Act. And so families, like many that we know, they will say, well, I might like to go to private school, but there's not an appropriate education there, so I'm not going to. I'm going to stay with the public school. So we've just taken the dollars away from the public school. But all the kids with the significant needs, the needs that are really costly to deal with, are going to stay in the public school. It's a spiral that is a bad spiral. We will defund you, but all the kids with the significant needs that are kind of costly, they're going to stay. And then that will dilute and hurt the quality of the education that they'll get, while the private school is getting the money and not having to follow the requirements of the IDEA. They get the money. They don't have to be equally accountable for it. They don't have to follow the requirements of the IDEA. This is very, very troubling stuff. So those were the three questions that I got to ask her in 5 minutes. Can you be a champion of public schools? Do you believe that any school receiving federal taxpayer dollars should be equally accountable for student outcomes? And should schools receiving federal taxpayer dollars have to follow the requirements of the IDEA? And each of those questions, I was prepared to get an answer I liked, but I got an answer I didn't like. I don't think Mrs. DeVos can be a champion of public schools. She has told me she doesn't think all schools should be equally accountable to receive federal taxpayer dollars. And she's not committed to schools that are receiving federal monies following the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I think that's why this explains to me why the volume of calls into my office over this have been so high. Higher than the government shutdown, higher than any other nominee, higher than any other issue. We've been at war with ISIS for 2.5 years, and I've been trying to make the case that we shouldn't be at war without a vote of Congress. I get a lot of calls in my office about it, but it's not ringing off the hook like it's been ringing off the hook with respect to the DeVos nomination. And while I credit Ms. DeVos for being philanthropic, and I credit her for caring about kids, and that's very sincere. I see that in her philanthropy and her care. I don't see in her an understanding of the role that public schools play for 90% of our kids. And using arguments like states' rights arguments, that brings up a real painful history in my state, and I don't want to see that return, and especially be kind of at the pinnacle of educational policy. I mentioned the volume of calls that we're receiving, and we've all asked ourselves in the office, what has explained this volume? I think the thing that explains the volume is the disability issue. Because a lot of folks with disabilities are not used to their issues ever being made front and center in anything. It matters so much to them. And as we've said, every family has somebody with a disability or who will have a disability. And people know folks with disabilities. But the disability community, which is Democrat, Republican, Independents in every zip code in this country, they're not used to their issue being the front and center issue in something. They're a little more used to kind of being ignored or kind of being marginalized. And so at this hearing, when the disability issue became kind of front and center, I think that's one of the reasons that the uptick of concern has been so significant. Because people who otherwise are not that into politics or otherwise not that into who's the cabinet secretary going to be, there's one thing they do know, which is they want Americans with disabilities to receive equal treatment. They want them to be all they can be. It's good for their happiness and good for our economy and good for our society. I was honored last week to write an op-ed about this issue with a former member of this body, Senator Harkin of Iowa. Madam President, somebody I know that you know very, very well. Senator Harkin was one of the congressional authors of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Senator Harkin was a champion of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. All the issues surrounding Americans with disabilities were very, very close to his heart. We really missed that because he was such a champion, and I'm not sure anybody can really fill his shoes on that issue. But we wrote an op-ed about this disabilities point in Time magazine that has gotten a lot of attention because it touches every family. So I'll start to recap a little bit now as I await my colleague who is going to be following me. But I'll just go back to where I started. This is not a minor matter. It's a little bit unusual to be on the floor at 10 till 4 in the morning. It's a little bit unusual to be speaking 30 hours in a row. And I've had some folks ask me, wow, why would you do, 30 hours of speeches on this? And I said, well, don't you think 30 hours... Don't you think the Secretary of Education is important enough? Education in our country is important enough to spend a day and a half, a day and a quarter talking about it? I go back to that Jeffersonian vision. Progress in government and all else depends upon the broadest possible diffusion of knowledge among the general population. The U.S., really beginning in the early 1900s, and then after the GI Bill, it really accelerated. We became the educational leader in the world. We weren't necessarily that during the 1800s. Germany and other nations, England were, but we really became the great educational leader. We made education available to all. The GI Bill helped democratize higher education and make it available to many, many more. Our education system is still one of our crown jewels. The number of foreign students who come to our country to go to college compared to the reverse is still a tribute to the fact that our education system is so strong. I haven't really talked about higher education at all. That's also within the province of the Secretary of Education. But the basic point that I'm making is of anything we do that's about whether we'll be successful as a country tomorrow, education is key. So that's why we're taking 30 hours to dig into issues of concern. I've put 3 on the table. The 3 I've put on the table are all about K-12 education. I had colleagues at the hearing who asked searching questions about higher education, the cost of higher education, student loan debt. What's the right way to deal, with debt? How do we make college less expensive? These are critical issues too. I'm very passionate about career and technical education because my dad was a welder and I ran a school in Honduras that taught kids to be carpenters and welders. This is a big and important job. But there's some... While you cannot, it's such a big and important job, it would be wrong to expect any person to be an expert on all of it. That would not be a fair hurdle to set for somebody. You're going to have to come in and bring an expertise in and then hire good people to work with you. But I do think there are some kind of fundamental threshold questions. Can you support and be a champion for public education? That seems fundamental. Do you believe in equal accountability for everybody that gets federal dollars? That seems fundamental. Do you believe that kids with disabilities should be able to get this kind of education? That seems